This is a board.
Yes.
Brains.
Definitely a board.
And writing. And here is Dave Vago. This is his board. Now, who are you?
No one really, no one.
Yes.
I mean, what's interesting probably about this board is it just represents some person's thoughts from the past year or two, that, you know, sort of gives you an external scratch pad in which to sort of put all your thoughts into one place. Sometimes it's nice. It's easier to put it there than to keep it in here, right? So what you're seeing is, yes, exactly that. It's the things that have happened in my sort of head for a long time. But we really just start here with this quote up here. This happiness is unintended side effect of one's personal dedication to a course greater than oneself. That sort of, I think, you know, being on the top sort of fuels the inspiration, and then so let's see, we can start anywhere really. What is mindfulness? I mean, this is something that I'm always asking myself. I've got a few different versions of what other people have said it is, either self-regulation and present-centered awareness. Other people have said, oh, well, it's actually intention, attention, and awareness. And so using that, I've tried to build upon that and come up with my own ideas, which are in different areas that didn't fit on the board, have been put in different parts of this room. But they sort of relate to this. If we go to what's happening in the mind when, you know, one is meditating, for example, these are just two modalities that you can that sort of arise in people's minds, and it's really talking about what happens if you start to understand how objects of one's attention, either visual or auditory, arise. We're going in instead of a usual time usually goes in the sort of linear horizontal plane, but here we're doing a vertical plane. So time is really going down in this direction. So something arises, a visual object, a mental sort of image arises, and then it passes. And so once you're able to refine your meditation techniques, you can start to really notice the change between arising and passing. And then eventually you get to a point where you can you see things gone or vanish. And this can all be actually related to flow. Flow sort of can be experienced throughout the entire. Flow is sort of just the dynamic changes of seeing things moving and rippling in time throughout the entire process. So it's not static. It's not. There's a constant change going on, and actually, so really this is a dynamic board too.
It just changed.
So it's just changed. It's really rest word right there, and this flow relates to this whole sort of process can be in flow. But you can actually, once something vanishes, then you can actually rest and observe what's happening at rest. And then if something all disappears, then you can have cessation, which is sort of naroda, it's the real true gone, the big G, gone.
Big G, is that what you call it?
Big G, that's what Shinzen calls it.
Oh, okay.
Big G.
Okay.
Versus little g, which is just the absence of that thing being there anymore. But the big G is something that's like complete absence of self and all the strands that make up everything in consciousness. But the other thing really that's worth saying about this is, well, that all sort of relates to what we're going to sort of define as to what is mindfulness. And then I guess we can sort of move this way. I guess this part of the brain is probably one of the most critical pieces, we think, for what's happening here, because what you don't see here, you see and hear, but there's also a sort of a somatic or viscerosomatic aspect of what's happening, and that viscerosomatic sensation of what's happening inside, putting like a feeling in the body for all motion, comes from this structure here. This is called the insula. It's located sort of deep within the folds of your brain. So if you were to sort of open up, there's a little prop here.
Oh.
See, here's a brain.
Oh, a brain.
So if you open up the fold here, actually it's probably better for you this way. You open up the fold here, this is the lateral fissure, and we just open it up, you'll see this. And so that's the insula. What's so cool about it is that it represents sort of the whole internal sort of feeling states from very primary sort of sensory sort of information. It represents things like homeostatic motor function going on in the more posterior aspects. And then as you move more interior, you get these environmental sort of things that are going on in the body. And then you start moving into the more human-like things that are very unique to humans in the anterior portion. And this portion here is actually 35% larger in humans than it is in macaque monkeys. So there must be something special about it. Macaque monkeys actually only have this posterior and mid portion of it, and it's actually that whole posterior and mid portion is just extended throughout the entire length of the insula of macaque monkeys. There's also something really interesting about this anterior portion. It's more important for hedonic conditions like or motivational, social, cognitive feelings of other and yourself and how you relate to the world, the sort of more emotional types of states. That part's here. Okay, there's also these special neurons here called von Economou neurons. They're very special types of neurons that it's possible that autistic children or adults even may not even have that type of neuron there, and that may be part of the reason that they don't have those type of connections with others and oneself. So this is a really special part of the brain interior insula, which may be very important for meditation and developing an understanding of oneself. And so you may need this, and it actually grows in size after only 8 weeks of meditation.
How much? How much can it grow?
I don't know. I mean, you do have a
Permanently
skull.
grows?
Yeah.
Will it grow and then go back down if you stop meditating?
That we don't know. That's a
okay.
good question. So let's see, what else we got here? We got, we can go focus right here, which is the stages of insight. So as you meditate, you can go through different various stages, and these are sort of described by different various people. This is described in sort of Sudhimagga, the path to liberation, so the traditional Buddhist text. Other people have described it who are just more modern sort of Buddhist geeks, I guess you can call them, like Daniel Ingram or someone like that. And they sort of describe these stages as a thought, cause and effect, impermanence, suffering, and no self, realizing that those types of things is one stage. Arising and passing away would be another sort of stage of realization or just understanding anicca or impermanence. And it sort of relates back to what this was, because remember I told you see arising and passing of an object in space, but this is just sort of a one-time thing. You may see the arising and passing of an object over and over and over again until you realize, oh my God, everything's arising and passing, including myself. And that's sort of what this stage is really referring to. Then eventually you move to dissolution, where everything sort of just dissolves. And that can be kind of scary. Because you go through these stages, which some people refer to as the dark night, which is terror, misery, and disgust. And then once if you get past that, which some people get through really quickly, some people take a long time. In any case, then you can move into some aspect of re-observation, where you observe what's going on inside your head, and you gain equanimity, which is a powerful sort of way of experiencing the world, sort of like a sturdy mast in a storm does on a sailboat. And then you enter stream entry, and this may be a little bit overrated, but I'm not sure if this is a goal for everybody. But it's a state that people describe as sort of a selfless state, where it's a complete paradigm shift, and once you're there, it's not likely that you're going to come out of the stream. But it's one of the stages of developing insight. However, there's going to be arguments about this. Let's see, so where we are right now. So we can go up here, there's a few brain areas.
Good, brain areas.
Let's see, we can talk about the amygdala, which is really one of the areas that we're really interested in, and how it connects to all these different areas in the frontal lobe. These are the medial frontal areas. There's numbers there, like the numbers all correspond to different sort of subsystems, really sub areas of the brain that have been distinguished by the orientation of really just cells, but have also functional differences, like area 25, BA25 is what they call the subgenual cingulate. It's interesting because you can stimulate this area in people who have intractable forms of depression, people who just can't be cured by drugs, psychotherapy, ECT, you name it, they just can't be cured. They have depression and they're just in the blues. They have a lot of problems. What they found is actually if you stimulate this area with deep brain stimulation, so electrodes deep into the brain go zzz, zzz, suddenly they like wake up and they're happy. So it's really interesting to think that there can be those sort of substrates in the brain where you can stimulate and suddenly people are happy who weren't. So that's one of the reasons why we do this work, is so we can understand like what areas of the brain are involved with different types of psychopathology and emotion, and then we can sort of better use these ideas as sort of diagnostic tools, and then for better targeted therapy. Then you have DLPFC, which is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is important for working memory and sort of goal-directed thinking and sort of concentration. Then this whole area can be considered sort of the orbital frontal cortex, that's OFC. And then the ACC, which is the anterior cingulate cortex, which is also one of the most important areas of the brain, because you see that area light up for practically everything. But the dorsal cingulate is probably one of the parts that are really important for meditation. We see that it grows also in size like the insula, but has a different functional mechanism. It's more for monitoring, so like awareness, meta-awareness. Dorsal and anterior cingulate seems to be really important for that. We can stay somewhere, let's see, we can move over to here, and we see mindfulness versus CBT. So this is sort of just a study that we were thinking of looking at, well, if cognitive behavioral therapies happens to be one of the most effective sort of treatments for depression and anxiety and different other forms of psychopathology, well, how does it hold up in a horse race against mindfulness? And what, if we even know what mindfulness is, you can think of it as an 8-week program of learning how to meditate and doing some hatha yoga. So the question, I guess, here is can it hold up and reduce some of the aspects of psychopathology, the symptoms that are related to psychopathology that CBT was intended to target. And so CBT was developed by a guy named Aaron Beck, and he created this triad of things that are going on in people's worldview. One is rumination and sort of negative sort of aspects of processing things over and over again in one's head. And a very sort of negative self-focus. So thinking about oneself in a negative framework was his first sort of aspect of his triad. And the other one was a negative worldview towards the present and the future. And these are actually all of this together creates his triad. So if you're thinking about yourself as negative, the world is negative, in the past everything sucked, and in the future everything's gonna suck. That's basically what's happening when you have depression in sort of the Beck sort of model. You may agree or disagree with some of the things I say, but this is just a slice of my thinking on the board. That's all you're really getting here. And so some of the things that you see in these types of people across most psychopathologies: emotional reactivity, people who react to emotional stressor in a way that's maladaptive, that's perseverative, that stays on all day, you can't let it go. Either you can avoid things, that's also a bad emotion regulation strategy. You just either perceptually avoid things, you don't even look at the things that sort of bother you, or you just choose not to deal with it when you see it. Suppress emotion, it's a blunted response, also not good for you. So CBT, 1 year relapse rate is about 25%. So that's interesting. So people who get therapy that sort of focuses on these aspects of the world, in 1 year they will actually, only 25% of the people will actually relapse back into depression or some form of psychopathology. Antidepressant use is 50%. So clearly drugs are not as effective, at least in that sort of context, as CBT. Turns out that mindfulness with some CBT is also as effective in preventing relapse for people who have experienced at least 3 episodes of depression. And so that sort of fits into that equation as well. And so we're interested in sort of things like bias, rumination, emotional reactivity, and avoidance, and how do we target these things and sort of measure them. So that turns into stickies, and it sort of adds more to the story here. And so the question, I guess, here is augmentation. Well, can we augment traditional forms of approaches like CBT and antidepressants with mindfulness as an augmentation strategy? So we're not just saying no drugs, but we're saying, okay, we'll give you some drugs, but we want to augment that strategy with something like mindfulness. And that may be more helpful. Then you see some more little, I think we're moving along here. We get them yellow stickies here. So some of the sort of the concepts that I've been thinking about, I guess, for mindfulness, mind clearly is one of them. Dullness, level of dullness is something we need to understand. Effort that moves from positive, to little, to negative, meaning like no effort. Mental defilements, things that sort of cloud your mind and that produce problems, thinking negative thoughts. Distraction is also part of. These are actually parts of that came out of the Tonka painting of the path, stages of insight. I sort of took the pieces out and put on the yellow stickies, and so they're all parts of the path to insight that sort of arise, and you have to deal with them. And meta awareness, mindfulness just says what's the outcome. It's really a calm mind, a stabilized mind, and insight into one's mind. And this little loop is sort of my way of describing that you are S, and as you go through this path, you sort of loop around in the spiral and you come out with S primed, something a little different. And in the back here you see a Chinese or kanji character sort of what maybe mindfulness can be described as a kanji character for presence and the kanji character for heart. Together they create mindfulness, presence of heart. Maybe a good way to think about it. Oh, and then you have a little Chitta Bhavana, a development of mind, spiritual cultivation, something else, some more sort of little, I guess, aspect of what we think about. What else? So now we can talk about craving. We talk about craving, for example, for cigarettes or even craving for, from the Buddhist point of view, is sort of an abstract concept. It's not so simple as just one area of the brain. And so if you look at all the literature out there on where craving is located in the brain, whether it's for cigarettes in terms of addiction or craving in terms of even a loved one that you lose, so for a loss, there's different parts of the brain that are involved. So many parts of the brain that it's going to be really hard to try to localize. If you look here, this is the right hemisphere. These are all the areas of the brain with little hash marks that from all the research that we looked at have aspects of involvement in craving. So this is just the right side, and the left side is down here. So there's a lot of things going on in terms of the brain activity for craving. So it's not so simple. If we go here, you can see some of the things we've listed here. This actually, I guess I haven't looked at this in a while, because this craving, rumination, self-regulation, emotion regulation, attention, these are actually some aspects of how we think the arrows, I guess, are working, that mindfulness may be working. Maybe reducing craving, reducing rumination, reducing avoidance and reactivity, increasing the efficiency of attention, improving pro-social and ethical development, and maybe working at unconscious levels, Hebbian learning, so sort of associative conditioning, facilitating extinction and reconsolidation, decreasing resource allocation, so improving the efficiency of your whole brain. And then, let's see, what else? Okay, there's two more things on this board. If you can imagine, I think we've talked enough, but
That's
two
great.
More things.
Great.
We got schizophrenia.
Oh, good. Let's go to schizophrenia.
Okay, schizophrenia is right up here.
Okay.
So it turns out that we have multiple paradigms that we test schizophrenics on, and one of them is an emotional memory task. We give schizophrenics a bunch of words that could be thought-provoking or disturbing to a schizophrenic, and they show increases in all these brain areas, in the parahippocampal areas, and the amygdala, and the insula, medial-prefrontal, and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And so what does it all mean? Well, you create a story out of it. I'm not going to go into the whole story, but essentially you have all these areas that sort of come online related to emotional memory, and which makes sense. And we always compare these the brain areas activation to a normal subject. So increases in the insular activity may be some sort of emotional sort of reactivity, and evaluative type of thing going on as well. Decreased PCC, which may represent some sort of decreased representation of self or autobiographical nature of oneself. So we don't know exactly how it all pieces together. You sort of have to read the paper to get the sense of really how it all fits together, or else you just see a bunch of arrows. But then there's another paradigm.
Read the paper? What paper?
A paper will probably come out of it. On schizophrenia, and we did a CBT intervention with them actually, and so it turns out schizophrenics can respond to CBT. Remember CBT? That was CBT.
Yeah. Thank you.
AT, that means anticipatory threat. We looked at how schizophrenics sort of anticipate threat, and so it turns out that they have these really interesting increases in activity in visual association areas. What does that mean? It could be that they're really processing threat at a very sort of primary level of sensory processing, much more activity going on there than a normal individual would, and that could also facilitate how one processes threat. If there's increased sensory processing, then that could also lead to increased interpretation of threat. And the amygdala and the hippocampus go up too. That means that there's also increases in sort of autonomic reactivity to the threat. And when they're in safety, when they know that they can be safe and that there's no threat, there's still increased processing and the visceral sort of activities going on, and some of the precuneus activity as well. So what does that mean? I mean, we're not sure for sure, but there's definitely some extra processing going on that's probably unnecessary. I'm trying to interpret what's happening. Okay, so there's one last thing here that we can really sort of focus on, I guess, for this board. And I think it's probably this little board thing here. This is the default mode network. We hate the default mode network because it's confusing.
Who hates it?
I hate it because it represents what happens to your mind when it's wandering. They call it stimulus-independent thought. So what you do when you're thinking, when you're not really doing anything else, it's not goal-directed, it's very passive. But when it's passive, it's actually doing a lot of things. It's self-reflecting about the past or the future. And Randy Buckner's group has sort of parsed apart or sort of used very highly advanced statistical modeling techniques to say that there's actually two subsystems within the default mode network. One could be the DMPFC network, which is the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex network. That involves the TPJ, temporal parietal junction, also a very interesting area. Even if you're bored already, this is an area that if you stimulated, you would have an out-of-body experience. It's a very dissociative area. So TPJ is actually quite interesting. And the lateral temporal cortex and the temporal pole, that's one network. And the other one would be the medial temporal lobe network, which involves ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And what's so cool about this area? It's the evaluative in nature, the sense that whenever you evaluate anything, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex comes online. But it also involves posterior inferior parietal lobe, hippocampal formation, so areas that are more related to memory than autobiographical memory. And it turns out that that subsystem is more important for maybe thinking about oneself in the future, whereas this network is more important for thinking about oneself in the present, whether it's oneself or other.
Can you see these different networks when you look at the brain?
Yeah, so yeah, exactly. So we'll
activate separately.
Right.
Okay.
So that's what we're hoping to sort of disambiguate them from what people are doing when they're doing nothing. It's not sort of a default mode. Everyone has different things that they think about when they're not thinking about anything. And meditators happen to have a problem thinking about or wandering really far. So that they're going to look very different from a lot of people, especially the people who ruminate. But they look very different. there's also this little area here, which actually is 2 nodes of the default mode network that are shared between these 2 subsystems. That's the anterior medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. They just happen to be the connections for the whole default mode network. Okay, well, thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. That was great. Insert applause here.